The day Venezuela moved a submarine and why no one is talking about what it really means. Let me take you back to the morning of June 12, 2024. At first glance, it was just another routine naval exercise, Venezuela's Caribe 2024, a show of force in the southern Caribbean, complete with live-fire drills and coordinated maneuvers. But then something happened that didn't make the front page of the New York Times or the BBC. A Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, the Cebalo, one of the few in Latin America capable of sustained underwater operations, suddenly altered its patrol route. It didn't just participate in the exercise. It vanished from standard tracking for 72 hours, reappearing only after surfacing near the exclusive economic zone of Trinidad and Tobago, a country that just happens to host a U.S. military forward operating location at Piarco International Airport. Now, if you're thinking this is just another Latin American military posturing, you're missing the because this wasn't just a submarine changing course. This was a calculated signal, one that triggered an immediate, though carefully muted, response from Washington, London, and even Beijing. And if you think this is about Venezuela flexing its muscles, you're looking at the wrong map. I've spent the last 3 decades studying how small states exploit great power competition, how naval movements become diplomatic chess pieces, and how it looks like chaos is often the result of quiet, back-channel agreements. And let me tell what happened in the Caribbean last month wasn't just a military exercise. It was the opening move in a much larger game, one that could redefine the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. But before we get into what's really going on, let's start with what they want you to believe. The officially routine exercise gone slightly off script. According to the Venezuelan Ministry of Defense, Caribe 2024 was a standard annual drill, designed to demonstrate the operational readiness of the Bolivarian Navy and safeguard national sovereignty. The submarine Cebalo, a German-built Type 209/1300 acquired in the 1980s, was simply part of the exercise, conducting simulated reconnaissance missions in international waters. When it briefly went dark, the explanation was temporary loss of satellite communication, a common enough occurrence in submarine operations. The U.S. Southern Command issued a bland statement acknowledging the exercise, noting that it was monitored closely but posed no immediate threat to regional security. The British Royal Navy, which maintains a persistent presence in the Caribbean through its Atlantic patrol tasking, didn't even comment. And the media? Well, the Miami Herald ran a short piece buried on page A8, while Reuters mentioned it in passing as part of a broader report on Latin American military spending. At first glance, it all seems perfectly reasonable. Venezuela has been conducting these exercises for years, often with Russian or Chinese observers present. The Cebalo is an aging submarine, hardly a match for U.S. or NATO anti-submarine warfare capabilities. And let's be honest, no one in Washington is losing sleep over Nicolas Maduro's navy. But here's the problem with this: it's too clean. Too convenient. And if you dig just a little deeper, the cracks start to show. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. First, let's talk about the Cebalo itself. Yes, it's old. Yes, it's diesel-electric, not nuclear. But here's what the defense analysts aren't: it's one of the few submarines in the region that can operate undetected in shallow waters, the kind that dominate the Caribbean. And while it may not be a threat to a U.S. carrier strike group, it is more than capable of laying mines, conducting covert surveillance, or, most critically, deploying special forces in a crisis. Now, why would Venezuela need that capability right now? Let's look at the timing. Just 2 weeks before the Cebalo's mysterious detour, the U.S. and Guyana signed a new defense cooperation agreement, allowing for extended American military access to Guyana's ports and airfields. This came on the heels of ExxonMobil's announcement that it had discovered yet another massive offshore oil field in Guyana's Stabroek Block, bringing the country's total recoverable reserves to over 11 billion barrels. For context, that's more than Venezuela's entire proven reserves, which have been crippled by years of mismanagement and U.S. sanctions. And here's where it gets interesting. Venezuela has never recognized Guyana's maritime borders, claiming that the entire Essequibo region, where most of Guyana's oil lies, belongs to Caracas. In December 2023, Maduro held a referendum in which Venezuelans approved the creation of a new state in Essequibo. The U.S. responded by conducting joint military exercises with Guyana. Brazil, which shares a border with both countries, put its northern military command on high alert. So when the Sabalo suddenly disappears near Trinidad, just 100 miles from Guyana's coast, it's not hard to connect the dots. This wasn't just a submarine going off course. This was Venezuela demonstrating that it could project power into disputed waters without triggering a full-blown crisis. And the fact that the US didn't scramble its P-8 Poseidon anti-submarine aircraft from Key West? That tells you something, too. Because here's the Sabalo didn't just vanish on its own. Someone let it vanish. And that someone wasn't in Caracas. The hidden Russia, China, and the new great game in the Caribbean. Let me tell you something I've learned from decades of watching how great powers no small country acts alone in a crisis. Not when the stakes are this high. And Venezuela's sudden naval assertiveness? It didn't happen in a vacuum. First, consider Russia. Moscow has been quietly rebuilding its influence in Latin America since the 2010s, and Venezuela is its most important ally in the region. The Sabalo's crew has trained with Russian submariners. Russian military advisors have been embedded with the Venezuelan Navy for years. And just last month, a Russian Yazan-class nuclear submarine, the same type that's been shadowing U.S. carrier groups in the Atlantic, made a port call in Havana. Coincidence? Hardly. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The Sabalo's disappearance coincided with a little-noticed visit to Caracas by a high-ranking Chinese official from the Central Military Commission. China has been Venezuela's lifeline since U.S. sanctions cut it off from global markets. It's bought Venezuelan oil at discounted rates, extended billions in loans, and most critically, helped modernize its military. And while China doesn't have a formal military alliance with Venezuela, it does have a strategic interest in ensuring that the U.S. doesn't gain uncontested access to Guyana's oil. So what's really happening here? Venezuela isn't just acting on its own. It's being encouraged by Russia, by China, and by a broader coalition of states that see the U.S. as a declining hegemon. And the Sabalo's maneuver wasn't just a show of force. It was a test. A test of U.S. resolve. A test of NATO's attention. And most importantly, a test of whether the U.S. is willing to risk a direct confrontation over a few billion barrels of oil in a region it has largely ignored for the past 2 decades. And so far? The results are telling. Because the U.S. response wasn't just muted. It was calculated. The broader geopolitical how this fits into the new Cold War. Let's out for a moment. Because what's happening in the Caribbean isn't just about Venezuela and Guyana. It's about the larger struggle for global dominance between the US, China, and Russia, a struggle that's increasingly being fought in the gray zone between peace and war. For the past 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption of unipolarity, that it could shape the world in its image without serious resistance. But that era is over. China is now the world's largest economy in purchasing power terms. Russia, despite its economic weaknesses, remains a nuclear superpower with a veto at the UN Security Council. And the global south, from India to Brazil to South Africa, is no longer willing to automatically align with Washington. This is the world of multipolarity, and it's a world where small states like Venezuela can punch far above their weight by playing great powers off each other. Now, let's talk about the Caribbean. For most of the 20th century, this was an American lake. The Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Bay of Pigs, all of it reinforced the idea that the U.S. would tolerate no foreign military presence in its backyard. But today? The Caribbean is contested territory. Russia has been extending its military footprint in the region for years. It has a signals intelligence facility in Nicaragua. It conducts regular naval exercises with Cuba. And in 2022, it signed a military cooperation agreement with Venezuela that included the possibility of Russian warships docking in Venezuelan ports. China, meanwhile, has been making inroads through economic means. It's the largest investor in the AMA Canal. It's building a deep water port in Jamaica. And it's been quietly buying up Caribbean debt, turning countries like Antigua and Barbuda into financial dependencies. And the U.S.? It's been distracted. First by the Middle East, then by Ukraine, and now by the looming crisis in the Taiwan Strait. The result? The Caribbean has become a vacuum, one that Russia and China are more than happy to fill. Which brings us back to the Cibalo. Venezuela's submarine maneuver wasn't just about Guyana. It was a message to you may have forgotten about us, but we haven't forgotten about you. And it was a message to Moscow and we're still in the game. But here's the thing about great power, it's not a zero-sum game. The more the US pushes back, the more Venezuela leans on Russia and China. The more Russia and China support Venezuela, the more the US feels compelled to respond. And the more this cycle continues, the greater the risk of miscalculation. Because this isn't the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it is the kind of low-level brinkmanship that can spiral out of control if no one is paying attention. And right now? No one in Washington seems to be paying enough attention. Military, why this isn't just posturing. Now, I know what some of you are. Venezuela is a basket case. Its military is a shell of what it was in the 1990s. A single US carrier strike group could wipe out its entire navy in a weekend. And you're not wrong. On paper, the Venezuelan military is a shadow of its former self. Years of corruption, brain drain, and sanctions have left it with aging equipment, poorly trained personnel, and chronic fuel shortages. The Cibalo may be a capable submarine, but it's one of only 2 operational subs in Venezuela's fleet. The rest are either mothballed or in such disrepair that they're little more than floating museums. But here's the thing about modern, it's not just about who has the biggest guns. It's about asymmetry. And Venezuela, with help from Russia and China, has been investing heavily in asymmetric capabilities. Let's talk about what that means in practice. First, there's electronic warfare. Venezuela has acquired Russian Krasuka 4 systems, which can jam NATO communications and radar. In a conflict, this could blind US surveillance assets, making it harder to track Venezuelan movements. Second, there's missile technology. Venezuela has a stockpile of Russian-made anti-ship missiles, including the Kh-35 Arun, which can be launched from land, sea, or air. These aren't game changers, but they do force the US to take the threat seriously. Third, there's cyber. In 2021, Venezuela's military intelligence agency, the DGCIM, was linked to a series of cyber attacks against US energy companies. And while these attacks were more annoying than crippling, they demonstrated that Venezuela has the capability to disrupt critical infrastructure in a crisis. And then there's the submarine. The Cibalo may be old, but in the shallow, crowded waters of the Caribbean, it doesn't need to be stealthy to be effective. It just needs to be present. And if it were to lay mines near Guyana's offshore oil platforms? That could shut down production for months. Now, am I saying Venezuela is about to launch a full-scale invasion of Guyana? No. That would be suicidal. But what I am saying is that Venezuela doesn't need to win a conventional war to achieve its objectives. It just needs to make the cost of US intervention too high to bear. And that's exactly what the Cibalo's maneuver was designed to do. The domestic political why this is about more than oil. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the US domestic politics. Because here's the foreign policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's shaped by elections, by public opinion, and by the short-term incentives of politicians. And right now? The Biden administration has a problem. On one hand, you have a Republican Party that's increasingly framing every foreign policy issue as a test of American strength. If Biden doesn't respond forcefully to Venezuela's provocations, he'll be accused of weakness. If he does respond, he risks escalating a crisis in an election year when the American public is already exhausted by foreign entanglements. On the other hand, you have a Democratic base that's deeply skeptical of military intervention. After Iraq, after Afghanistan, after Libya, the last thing most Americans want is another war, especially one over oil. And then there's the swing states. Florida, with its large Venezuelan and Cuban exile communities, is a critical battleground. Maduro knows this. And he's been playing to that audience, framing himself as the defender of Venezuelan sovereignty against US imperialism. So what does the Biden administration do? It walks a tightrope. It condemns Venezuela's actions in strong terms, but it doesn't take military action. It imposes new sanctions, but it doesn't cut off all diplomatic channels. And it sends a few warships to the region, but it doesn't escalate to the point of no return. This is classic strategic ambiguity, a way of signaling resolve without committing to a course of action that could spiral out of control. But here's the strategic ambiguity only works if your adversary believes you're willing to escalate. And right now, Maduro doesn't. Because he's seen this movie before. He saw Obama back down in Syria. He saw Trump's fire and fury threats against North Korea fizzle into a photo op. And he saw Biden's chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. So when the Sabalo disappeared near Guyana, and the U.S. response was a few strongly worded statements and a new round of sanctions, Maduro took that as a green light. And that's dangerous. Because the more the U.S. bluffs, the more emboldened its adversaries become. And the more emboldened they become, the greater the risk of miscalculation. Scenario how this could play out. So where does this go from here? Let's game out 3 possible scenarios, none of them good, but some worse than others. Scenario 1, the Cold War Redux. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela settle into a new normal of low-level confrontation. The US maintains its military presence in Guyana, but it doesn't escalate. Venezuela continues its provocations, submarine patrols, cyber attacks, maybe even a few more referendums, but it stops short of outright aggression. Russia and China provide just enough support to keep Venezuela afloat, but not enough to trigger a US military response. This is the most likely outcome in the short term. It's not ideal, but it's manageable. The problem? It's also unstable. Because the longer this standoff continues, the greater the risk of an accident, a misfired missile, a collision at sea, a cyber attack that spirals out of control. And in a crisis, accidents can become wars. Scenario 2, the proxy war. In this scenario, the US decides it can't afford to let Venezuela dictate the terms of the standoff. It ramps up support for Guyana, military advisors, intelligence sharing, maybe even a few hundred special forces operators. Venezuela responds by increasing its own military presence in Essequibo. Russia and China step up their support, sending more advisors, more weapons, more economic aid. Before long, you have a de facto proxy war, one that's contained for now, but could easily escalate. And if a US or Venezuelan soldier is killed? All bets are off. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. Because proxy wars have a way of spiraling. Look at Syria. Look at Yemen. Look at Ukraine. What starts as a limited conflict can quickly become a regional conflagration. And the Caribbean? It's not just any region. It's America's backyard. And if the US gets dragged into a prolonged conflict there, the geopolitical consequences could be catastrophic. Scenario 3, the direct confrontation. This is the nightmare scenario. Venezuela, emboldened by Russian and Chinese support, launches a limited military operation in Essequibo, maybe seizing a border town, maybe sabotaging an oil platform. The US, under pressure from hawks in Congress, responds with airstrikes. Venezuela retaliates by attacking US assets in the region. Russia and China condemn the US but stop short of direct intervention. And then? Then you have a war. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has been down this road before. In 1983, the Reagan administration invaded Grenada after a Marxist coup, citing the need to protect American medical students. The operation was a military success, but it poisoned US relations with much of the Caribbean for years. In 1989, the Bush administration invaded AMA to remove Manuel Noriega, another strongman who had outlived his usefulness. Again, a tactical victory, but a strategic disaster. The US was seen as a meddling hegemon, and the region's distrust of Washington deepened. Venezuela isn't Grenada or AMA. It's a country of 28 million people, with a military that, while poorly equipped, is battle-hardened from years of internal repression and external sanctions. And unlike in 1983 or 1989, the US no longer has the unchallenged dominance it once did. Russia has a military presence in Venezuela, including S-300 air defense systems and Wagner Group mercenaries. China has invested billions in Venezuelan infrastructure, including ports and telecommunications. If the US strikes, it won't just be fighting Venezuela, it'll be fighting a coalition of interests that have been preparing for this moment. Let's talk about the military implications for a second. The US would almost certainly establish a no-fly zone over Essequibo, which would require neutralizing Venezuela's air defenses. That's easier said than done. Venezuela's military has been training for asymmetric warfare for years, and its Russian-supplied systems are designed to counter US air superiority. In 2019, during a brief standoff with the US, Venezuela conducted live-fire exercises with its S-300s, sending a clear "we're ready." Now, I'm not saying Venezuela could shoot down a B-2 bomber, but they don't have to. All they have to do is force the US to expend resources, time, and political capital in a protracted conflict. And that's where the real danger lies. The longer this drags on, the more opportunities there are for miscalculation. A Venezuelan missile accidentally hits a US warship. A US airstrike kills civilians. A cyber attack takes down a power grid. Each of these incidents would ratchet up the pressure, and before long, you're in a war that no one wanted but no one knows how to stop. Now, let's out for a moment. The Essequibo crisis isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening at a time when the US is already stretched thin, supporting Ukraine, deterring China in the Taiwan Strait, managing tensions in the Middle East. The last thing Washington needs is another conflict, especially one in its own backyard. But here's the Venezuela knows this. Maduro isn't stupid. He's a survivor, and he's playing a weak hand brilliantly. By escalating the crisis, he's forcing the US to choose between two bad: either back down and look weak, or respond militarily and risk a wider war. And that's the genius of his strategy. He's not trying to win a conventional war. He's trying to make the cost of US intervention so high that Washington decides it's not worth it. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome, in my view, is a prolonged standoff, one where the US and Venezuela engage in a shadow war of cyber attacks, sanctions, and covert operations, while Russia and China provide just enough support to keep Maduro in power. It's not pretty, but it's preferable to open conflict. The problem is that this kind of low-intensity conflict has a way of escalating when you least expect it. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and suddenly you're in a situation where neither side can back down without losing face. And that's the real lesson here. In geopolitics, the most dangerous moments aren't the ones where everyone is screaming for war. They're the ones where everyone is pretending they don't want it while quietly preparing for it. Venezuela's submarine maneuver wasn't just a show of force. It was a signal. And signals, in this business, are often the first step toward something much worse. Now, what most people don't realize is that this crisis isn't just about oil or territory, it's about survival. Maduro's regime is teetering on the edge of collapse, and the Essequibo Gambit is his last-ditch effort to rally domestic support before the 2024 elections. The numbers tell that Venezuela's GDP has shrunk by 75% since 2013, inflation hit 234% in 2023, and over 7 million people have fled the country. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, who won the primary with 92% of the vote, poses the first real electoral threat to Chavismo in decades. The regime's response? A mix of repression, legal maneuvers, and now, this manufactured crisis. Let me explain why this matters. Maduro isn't just playing to the international audience, he's playing to the Venezuelan people. The Essequibo dispute is a classic diversionary tactic, one that dates back to Argentina's invasion of the Falklands in 1982 or Putin's annexation of Crimea in 2014. The logic is when your economy is in freefall and your people are starving, you create an external enemy to distract them. And it works, at least in the short term. Polls show that support for Maduro's handling of the Essequibo crisis has surged, even as his overall approval ratings remain abysmal. The regime's propaganda machine has been in overdrive, with state media portraying the dispute as a David and Goliath struggle against US imperialism. Never mind that Guyana is one of the smallest and poorest countries in South America. In the Chavista narrative, it's a puppet of ExxonMobil and the Pentagon. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's strategy is risky, but it's not irrational. The regime knows it can't win a fair election, so it's betting that a combination of repression, economic coercion, and nationalist fervor will keep it in power. The recent ban on Machado running for office under the pretext that she's a traitor for allegedly supporting U.S. sanctions is just the latest example of this playbook. But the Essequibo crisis adds a new dimension. By framing the dispute as an existential threat, Maduro is creating a pretext to declare a state of emergency, suspend elections, or even postpone them indefinitely. It's a tried and true tactic in Latin. When democracy becomes inconvenient, you manufacture a crisis to justify authoritarianism. Now, let's talk about the opposition. Machado is a formidable figure, charismatic, uncompromising, and backed by a broad coalition of parties. But she's also walking a tightrope. If she appears too soft on the Essequibo issue, she risks alienating nationalist voters. If she supports Maduro's claims, she undermines her own credibility as a Democrat. Her response so far has been to call for a peaceful resolution while emphasizing that the real enemy is the regime's corruption, not Guyana. It's a smart strategy, but it's also a fragile one. The regime has already accused her of being a sellout to foreign interests, and there are signs that it's preparing to escalate the crackdown. The recent arrests of opposition activists and the harassment of journalists suggest that Maduro is laying the groundwork for a more repressive phase. So where does this leave us? The most likely scenario, in my view, is a prolonged stalemate, one where the regime uses the Essequibo crisis to justify further repression while avoiding a full-scale war. The U.S. and its allies will continue to support Guyana diplomatically and militarily, but they'll stop short of direct intervention. Russia and China, meanwhile, will provide just enough economic and political cover to keep Maduro afloat. It's a grim equilibrium, but it's one that could last for years. The wild card, of course, is the Venezuelan military. The armed forces have been the backbone of the regime since Chávez's days, but their loyalty is not absolute. There are factions within the military that are unhappy with Maduro's leadership, particularly as the economy continues to deteriorate. The recent purge of high-ranking officers, including the arrest of General Raúl Baduel's son in 2023, suggests that Maduro is worried about dissent within the ranks. If the crisis escalates, the military could split, with some units supporting the regime and others defecting to the opposition. That's the nightmare scenario for a civil-military conflict that spirals out of control. But let's not kid ourselves. The chances of a democratic transition in Venezuela are slim. Maduro has survived sanctions, protests, and even a failed coup attempt in 2019. He's not going to give up power without a fight. The Essequibo crisis is just the latest chapter in a long saga of authoritarian resilience. The real question is whether the international community can contain the fallout without getting dragged into a wider conflict. Because if there's one thing we've learned from history, it's that manufactured crises have a way of becoming real ones. And in Venezuela, the stakes couldn't be higher. Now, what most people don't realize is that this entire Essequibo drama isn't just about oil or territory, it's about the survival of a geopolitical model. Venezuela under Maduro has become the poster child for what I call the authoritarian survival playbook, a regime that clings to power not through legitimacy, but through a mix of external patronage, internal repression, and manufactured crises. The Essequibo gambit is just the latest iteration of this strategy, and it's working, at least for now. The question is whether the international community has the strategic patience to outlast it, or if we're all sleepwalking into a conflict that no one actually wants but everyone is too stubborn to prevent. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. The Essequibo dispute isn't just a bilateral issue between Caracas and Georgetown, it's a test case for how revisionist powers exploit gray zone conflicts to redraw the rules of the game. Russia and China aren't just passive observers here, they're active enablers, providing Maduro with the diplomatic cover and economic lifelines he needs to defy Western pressure. Moscow's Wagner Group has been active in Venezuela for years, training security forces and securing gold mining concessions in the Orinoco Belt. Beijing, meanwhile, has extended over $60 billion in loans to Venezuela since 2007, much of it collateralized against future oil deliveries. These aren't acts of charity, they're investments in a client state that serves as a beachhead for their broader ambitions in the Western Hemisphere. Here's the uncomfortable: the US and its allies have no good options here. The Biden administration has tried to thread the needle by supporting Guyana's sovereignty while avoiding direct confrontation with Venezuela. The problem is that Maduro doesn't respond to nuance, he responds to weakness. The December 2023 referendum, where 95% of voters allegedly backed Venezuela's claim to Essequibo, was a sham, but it was also a Maduro is willing to escalate if he senses hesitation from Washington. The U.S. has since conducted joint military exercises with Guyana, including a high-profile visit by a U.S. Coast Guard cutter in January 2024. But these are symbolic gestures. The real question is whether the U.S. is prepared to back up its rhetoric with action if Venezuela crosses a red line, say, by seizing an offshore oil rig or blockading Georgetown. The alternative, of course, is to double down on containment. The U.S. could impose secondary sanctions on foreign firms doing business with Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, particularly those linked to the Essequibo offshore blocks. It could also extend military aid to Guyana, including air defense systems and coastal surveillance capabilities. But these measures come with risks. Sanctions have a poor track record of forcing regime change, just look at Cuba or Iran, and they often hurt the civilian population more than the elites. Meanwhile, arming Guyana could provoke an arms race in the region, with Venezuela turning to Russia or Iran for countermeasures. We've seen this movie in the 1980s. The U.S. backed the Contras in Nicaragua, only to watch the conflict spiral into a proxy war that destabilized Central America for decades. There's also the nuclear and negotiated settlement. The 1966 Geneva Agreement, which established the framework for resolving the Essequibo dispute, is still technically in force. The International Court of Justice has ruled that it has jurisdiction over the case, but Venezuela has refused to recognize its authority. A diplomatic solution would require Maduro to back down from his maximalist claims in exchange for sanctions relief or debt restructuring. The problem is that Maduro has no incentive to compromise. For him, the Essequibo crisis is a domestic political tool, not a genuine territorial dispute. Every time he escalates, his approval ratings tick up even if the economy is in freefall. The last time Venezuela held a relatively free election, in 2015, the opposition won a supermajority in the National Assembly. Maduro's response? He dissolved the legislature and created a parallel assembly pact with loyalists. That's not the behavior of a leader who's open to negotiation. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome, in my view, is a protracted low-intensity conflict, one where Venezuela engages in periodic provocations but stops short of all-out war. Maduro will continue to use the Essequibo issue to rally nationalist sentiment, while the U.S. and its allies will provide just enough support to Guyana to deter a full-scale invasion. Russia and China will keep Maduro afloat with loans and diplomatic cover, but they won't risk a direct confrontation with Washington. It's a messy equilibrium, but it's one that could persist for years, much like the frozen conflicts in Eastern Europe or the South China Sea. The real danger, though, is miscalculation. Maduro is a survivor, but he's also a gambler. In 2019, he survived a US-backed coup attempt and a crippling sanctions regime. In 2020, he weathered a bizarre maritime incursion by a ragtag group of mercenaries. But every time he rolls the dice, the stakes get higher. If he misjudges the international response to an Essequibo provocation, say, by seizing a Guyanese oil rig or shooting down a surveillance drone, the US might be forced to respond in ways that neither side anticipates. And that's when things get really dangerous. Let's not forget that Venezuela is a country with a long history of military adventurism. In the 19th century, Simón Bolívar's dream of a united South America collapsed into a series of border wars, many of them fueled by territorial disputes. In the 20th century, Venezuela fought a brief but bloody conflict with Colombia in 1987 over the Gulf of Venezuela. And in the 21st century, Chávez and Maduro have both used external threats to justify internal repression. The Essequibo crisis is just the latest chapter in this pattern, a pattern that has left Venezuela isolated, impoverished, and increasingly desperate. The broader lesson here is that authoritarian regimes don't just collapse under their own weight. They have to be pushed. The US and its allies have spent years trying to isolate Maduro, but they've failed to offer a credible alternative. The opposition, for its part, remains fractured and disorganized. The last serious attempt to unify the anti-Maduro forces, the 2019 Lima Group, fell apart when several countries recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president, only to see his support evaporate as Maduro consolidated power. Today, the opposition is weaker than it's been in years, with key leaders either in exile or behind bars. So what's the endgame? In the short term, I expect the status quo to a Cold War between Venezuela and Guyana, with the US and its allies providing just enough support to prevent a hot war. But in the long term, the only way out of this mess is a negotiated transition, one that requires Maduro to step down in exchange for sanctions relief and guarantees for his inner circle. The problem is that Maduro has no reason to trust such guarantees. The last time the US promised a soft landing for an authoritarian regime, it was in Libya in 2011, and we all know how that turned out. The uncomfortable reality is that Venezuela's crisis is a symptom of a larger geopolitical shift, one where revisionist powers like Russia and China are increasingly willing to challenge the US-led order in its own backyard. The Essequibo dispute isn't just about a strip of jungle or a few offshore oil blocks, it's about who gets to write the rules of the 21st century. And right now, Maduro is betting that the US is too distracted by Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East to care about a tiny country in South America. He might be right. But if he is, it's not just Guyana that loses. It's the entire idea of a rules-based international order. And that's a price none of us can afford to pay.